Putin deployed his forces in an irrational way. He created 3 armored groups. One located just west of Voronezh, east of Voronezh. One in Belarus, that one was coming down to Kiev. The one in the east was going to the eastern frontier. And one in Crimea. It looked like Heinz Guderian had been resurrected from the grave. This was a World War II structure and the typical problem of the Russian army. They've never gotten over Marshal Zhukov. If Marshal Zhukov attacked with tanks, we have to have tanks. During the Cold War, when I had some responsibility in trying to find out what the Russians were doing, it was an amazing thing. They were going to run on armor alone, leaving infantry behind. Now here's a secret. Tanks use gasoline or petroleum. And they never figured out how to keep up the gasoline trucks with the tanks. Or better yet, how not to get the gasoline trucks blown up with the tanks. They had all sorts of solutions, such as plastic pipes running. Okay? And the problem with plastic pipes is they leaked. So you figured they would fix it. So you go back next year and watch the same exercise, same leaking pipe. The same sort of action was taken in Ukraine. Which is first, he had 3 armored groups, uncoordinated with infantry. Almost impossible to manage at 200 miles apart. With 3 different loads of logistics required to run the tanks. And so he was attacking on 3 fronts in a country he thought would collapse. The result was, if you remember, the 40-kilometer line of tanks lined up. This was done, I believe, with 2 Javelin missiles knocking out the first 2 tanks, 2 Javelin missiles knocking out the last 2 tanks, and God took care of the mud on the right. One train was blocked. Another was not going very far. They were engaging along the frontier. And a final force that was supposed to go to Kiev couldn't get close to it. The psychological effect on the Ukrainians was enormous. What they also thought they would lose. They had thought that the Russians had a magnificent military force and knew how to operate. None of them, except for your grandfathers there, had ever fought in the Russian army and knew better. The transformation that took place in the Ukraine on realizing that the Russians really were unable to mount an effective offensive transformed the war. Suddenly the Ukrainians saw there was a purpose to fight. And the Russians had no real solution because they had not bought infantry. They wanted an armored war. They didn't bring in infantry until later. And the infantry said basically, where am I? Why am I here? The infantry was completely unprepared and then threw them into house-to-house fighting. Now, house-to-house fighting is ugly. But when you're attacking somebody's house who lives in it and he knows where the bathroom is, this is really putting it at a disadvantage. Every possible way to ambush you, every possible rooftop that you could be taken from, was knocking out massive casualties. Numbers we couldn't believe at the time, but were true. We're knocking out the Russians. In other words, the Russians had not planned the war, except on the assumption that the fact of an attack would paralyze the Ukrainians. Well, it did. Until they sat there and watched the Javelin missiles knocking out tanks, and they realized that their rifles could kill Russians too. Up to that point, the Americans had given precious little equipment to the Ukrainians. We didn't want to give it to the Russians. Until then, the Ukrainians were fighting a guerrilla war without central command, which seems foolish, except without a central command, there was no Schwerpunkt, so I could do it in German, Schwerpunkt to hit. There was no center of gravity of the enemy. There's no command structure that you could find. And the Russians milled around incoherently. They decided to do what the Russian army has always done when not clear of what to do. They started killing people randomly. They started attacking cities. Now, cities are not places to fight wars. They're places to show after you win. But they went into the cities, and when they couldn't take the cities, then the air power, which had never been coordinated with the tanks before, now coordinated with the infantry bombing cities. The problem with bombing cities is you didn't kill soldiers. You killed civilians. Bombing the cities created a sense of terror, but also a sense of rage. And the attack that was taken was by the new commander who had fought in Syria. And had been done very well in Syria. And nobody told Putin it's not Syria. You have a completely different structure that you had to face. So the Russians conducted an attack, fighting for a month for one lousy town, Mariupol. making it a martyr and spending how many troops at how much time. Because the Russians understood they only had so much time. They only had so much time. Their own people would tolerate this, but far more. They did not know what the Americans were going to do. And you have to understand how afraid the Russians are of Americans. Okay? When will the Americans come in? When will they come in? We didn't. There was no reason to come in. You want to fight like this for a month for Mariupol? We'll give you another city. Which do you like next? Urban warfare does not win wars. Not this kind of war. Okay? So they decided to fight for the Donbass region, which they already controlled, because it's predominantly Russian, and they'd always controlled the area, so they're going to have a new fight for it. Okay? They were going to give up the attempt to take Kiev, which was a very good idea because the tanks were still on the road somewhere, and they were going to fight for the south. They were going to take the south and try to join to Odessa. Theoretically, not a bad idea. But the problem here was that at this point, the Ukrainians had gotten the measure of the war, and the Americans changed their minds. And this was the key. Up until this weekend, the American view was, however long this takes, the Russians are going to kick their butts. But in the week prior to that, during conversations, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs says, I may have been wrong. Yeah, it's okay. Now what do you say? Ukrainians can hold. What do the Ukrainians need to be able to hold? And if you saw the list of weapons, we have suddenly armed a modern army. Ukraine, in the next month, will cease to be a bunch of guys with rifles and guts, but become the U.S. Army. Repeat with every complex weapon. Now, truth be told, the Poles have been training a lot of the Ukrainians in how to do these things. Poland is a kind of base for Ukraine and for the United States. We will deliver the weapons there, and the Ukrainians will suddenly, miraculously know how to use them. After this war, there's a Polish story. You know Polish jokes? That's a good one. So after this, all right, the Russians have a huge problem. The Americans have come. And they've come the way the Americans always come to a party, bearing big gifts. And the Americans are in, they don't want to lose. They would lose, but they don't want to. But they're coming in with enough power and no American troops. Only Ukrainian troops and U.S. Special Forces, and the British Special Forces, and, a few guys from Poland. Nothing serious. But we're coming in. Now you're Putin. You're seeing all of this go away. Everything you dreamt of. Recreating a secure Russia. So he has two choices. Hit him now hard with everything he has, which suffers from the question of how much does he have? Does he really have anything? Or is he flittered away in foolish activities? Or try to make a deal. If there was ever a moment for the Russians to make a deal, it's now, but the Russians can never make a deal when they're weak. The Russians must be strong. So one way to do it is have this Church. I have never seen an amazing army like the Russians. They are so strong. Let's talk. This is one sort of way we could do it, but we won't. Because now we can win. For the first time, the United States believes the Ukrainians can win. The Ukrainians no longer simply think they can hold. They think they can win. And the Poles always thought they could win. And if they didn't, sorry guys. So what we have here now is Putin's worst nightmare. And that's when the Russians are dangerous, when they confront their